Part 96. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 952. Due to a lot of delays due to the trip to the western regions, Tangning and Li Tianlan's 3-year agreement was postponed for half a year. Later, when Xiru became pregnant, he stayed in Guizhou for another half a year, a full year longer than the agreed time. With that ant's temperament, Tang Ning could imagine that after arriving in Chu, what awaited him would definitely not be calm. There will be unimaginable storms. However, things must be faced sooner or later. No matter what, he can't delay this trip to Chu State any longer. Xiaoi was just pregnant, and her due date was still more than half a year away. Half a year was enough for him to travel to Chu State. Tang Ning did not plan to take Lao Zhen with her when she went out this time. After all, every time he went out, Lao Zhen was loyally guarding him and he spent very little time with his daughter. Only after Tang Ning had her daughter did she know what it was like to be a father. During this time, let him take good care of himself. Let's spend some time with my daughter. Naturally, Tang Yaoyao couldn't take her with him. If one jealous person was upset, Tang Ning would have a headache. If two were upset at once, he couldn't imagine what that would be like. Fortunately, she was busy with business at the Chamber of Commerce, so it was impossible to stay with him this time. This time she went to Chu State not to fight, so she just took the two elders with her. She decided to leave as soon as possible. Tang Ning spent a few days arranging things at home. During this period, she also received a reply from Mr. Su, and the arrangements were made. After everything is done, prepare to leave in 2 days. The day before leaving, Tang Ning was sitting in the pavilion blowing in the wind, wondering if there was anything he had missed. Xiao Xiao slowly walked over and stood behind Tang Ning. While holding Tang Ning's shoulders, she asked, "Brother, am I not, can I go to Chu State with you?" Ah, Tang Ning was a little surprised and asked, "Why are you going to Chu country?" Xiao Xiao lowered his head and said, "I miss Sister Lan." The last time they went to Chu State, they happened to meet Li Tianlan. Xiao Xiao had lived in the princess mansion for a long time, and he thought he had some feelings for her. Moreover, he didn't know if it was Tang Ning's misunderstanding, but he always felt that Xiao Xiao was always depressed after returning to Guizhou, as if he had something on his mind. Tang Ning initially thought that she was not used to the environment here, but after asking her several times, she just shook her head silently. Although Tang Ning didn't know the reason, she gradually discovered that she seemed to really dislike this place. Naturally, Tang Ning would not refuse her request. However, before he could speak, the old beggar snorted and said, "Boss Tang, doesn't my dear disciple just want to go to the Chu kingdom with you? You are hesitant and hesitant. What's the matter? If you don't want to take her there, I can take her there myself." Tang Ning smiled and touched her little head and said, "Are you not used to living in Guizhou?" Xiao Xiao nodded sheepishly. Although Guizhou has been developing rapidly over the past year, for those who are used to living in the capital, it still feels like a remote place. Tang Ning smiled and said, "Pack your things and we'll set off tomorrow. Brother is the best." Tang Ning felt like she was kissing her gently on the face, and then she happily ran back to pack her luggage. Tang Ning touched her cheek helplessly, but noticed something strange in the atmosphere. When she turned to look at the old beggar, she found that he was looking at her with an evil look. The old beggar looked at Tang Ning and said with stern eyes, "Boy Tang, it seems that I have to have a chat with you." Tang Ning asked casually, "What are you talking about? Be more serious, me." The old beggar looked at him seriously and said, "My precious disciple is already a big girl. Although you are his adopted brother, you must also know how to avoid suspicion. You must not kiss you if you are a man or a woman. Understand?" If it weren't for Xiao Xiao, Tang Ning would have died in that alley in Lingzhou 5 years ago. In this life, as long as she has a bowl of rice from him, Xiao Xiao will never be hungry. Although she is not her biological sister, Tang Ning regards her as closer than a family member. How can she allow this old guy to slander her? If Tang Ning hadn't been unable to defeat him, she would have fallen out with him long ago. Tang Ning frowned slightly and asked, "What have you been thinking about all day?" The old beggar looked at him with squinted eyes and said, "What I am thinking about is not something." The old guy's words were a bit scolding, and Tang Ning was a little angry and said, "She is my sister first, and then your apprentice. You don't need to teach me some things." The old beggar sat down opposite him and said, "I also want to go to Chu with you." "Whatever." The old beggar obviously had ulterior motives, but Tang Ning didn't care. If he didn't go, he wouldn't go. If he went, he could become a free thug, so why not? What I didn't expect was that after a while, Lao Zheng also made the same request. "You want to go to Chu country too?" Tang Ning looked at him and asked in surprise, "You won't accompany my daughter?" "I have been with her for more than half a year, and I have long been annoyed by her father," Lao Zheng said. "Idle time is idle. Last time I met a master in Chu state, and I suffered a small loss without warning. This time I went to see what I could do. I can't get my place back." Tang Ning originally didn't plan to let Lao Zheng accompany him, but since he asked for it, Tang Ning didn't stop him. One more person would bring more strength. One more person, the ant might leave some for him because of the large number of people. Save face. After leaving Gazhu this time, Tang Ning was worried about Xiao Yi the most. How could she feel at ease when others were taking care of her? It was late at night, and Tang Ning was still in the study, perfecting several food supplements and even arranging a plan for her recovery after giving birth. Qing'er pushed the door open from outside and quietly placed a midnight snack on the table in front of him. Then she walked behind him and skillfully helped him massage his shoulders. Qing'er's cooking skills had obviously improved a lot in the past few days. Tang Ning drank a few sips of soup, gently grabbed her hand, and let her sit on his lap. "Aunt, uncle." A voice of surprise and panic came to his ears. The voice was also very familiar, but it was not from Qing'er, who Tang Ning was familiar with. He lowered his head and looked at Xiu'er, who was leaning on his chest. He was stunned for a moment. Xiu'er leaned her head on his chest and hugged her tightly. Tears flashed in her eyes. She sobbed and said, "We've uncle, have you finally remembered Xiu'er?" The delicate body in his arms was trembling slightly. Tang Ning could feel the mood of the girl in his arms. He was about to push her hand away, but he slowly took it back. He hugged the girl in his arms, watching her cry with joy in his arms. While hugging her tightly, he also sighed in his heart. There were more than one or two stubborn maids like Xiu'er and Qing'er. It was all because of this evil feudal society. Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 953. Tang Ning looked at Tang Yao Yao's contemptuous eyes and simply chose to remain silent. Anyway, his image in her mind can no longer be changed. Whether she eats Xiu'er or not, it won't change much. The four of them said goodbye to everyone and set out on the road to Chu State the next day. This was Tang Ning's second trip to Chu State, and she chose a different path. This time, without the official background of Chen State, they kept a low profile, but they saw many things that they did not see last time they came to Chu State. Chu State is a new generation powerful country. For a long time, it has been shrouded in the shadow of Chen State. It was not until a few years ago that it got rid of Chen State's control and was able to develop independently. After walking through several state capitals, Tang Ning clearly noticed that Chu State had learned from Chen State in many of its systems, and those Chen State systems were only implemented and perfected by Tang Ning in the past 2 years. In a certain state of Chu State, when a few people were bored and watched the county magistrate interrogate a case, they discovered that the magistrate was a woman. In Tang Ning's impression, although there were female officials in the Chu State, they were limited to Li Tianlan's Princess Palace. The only way to select county magistrates was through the imperial examination. This shows that there are already women in the Chu state participating in the imperial examination. It is not a pretentious military examination performed by Chen state, but through the imperial examination. After passing the civil examination, you can enter the court as an official. In this world, Xiaoan is the only one who possesses such advanced consciousness. Before the unification of the western regions, Xiaoan could only be regarded as a small country in the eyes of Chu state. Chu state not only learned from Chen state, but was so crazy that it even wanted to learn from Xiaoan's system. While Chu state continues to develop and become stronger, several princes of Chen state are still busy fighting and rebelling. Perhaps one day, the status of the two countries will be completely reversed. Of course, this trip to Chu state was not all smooth sailing. During this period, I also encountered mountain bandits and horse bandits twice, trying to rob and seek wealth. The results were tragic as expected, and I was almost saved by old Zheng to another world. In addition, there are also some other episodes that are not pleasant. At this moment, more than 10 feet in front of them, there were more than 100 figures, weapons unsheathed, pointing at them from a distance. A young man in rich clothes, with half his face obviously swollen, stood behind the crowd and looked at them with a spiteful expression. The cause of the matter is actually very simple. When Tang Ning and others passed by this place called Xianzhou, Xiao Xiao was spotted by a local dude. The dude chased her and beat her fiercely at first, but he still maintained his grace. After stalking for a long time and getting no response from Xiao Xiao, he revealed his true colors and uttered threatening words. The result was that his face was swollen by the old beggar who never wanted to let his precious apprentice suffer, and several of the guards around him were instantly killed, leading him to flee. However, what Tang Ning didn't expect was that this dandy young man seemed to have some real energy in Xianzhou. After they left the city today, they were surrounded by more than 100 officers and soldiers. The young man stood in the crowd, looked at the old beggar, Tang Ning, and others, gritted his teeth and said, "Old guy, aren't you a good fighter? Today I want to see where you can run." He looked at the leader of the officers and soldiers and said, "Come along, don't hurt the girl, the rest of us don't care whether they live or die." Although the officers and soldiers were reluctant, they still listened to the young man's words and approached Tang Ning and others. The eighth elder raised his hand and threw something into the group of officers and soldiers. The next moment, a plume of smoke appeared in the crowd. Including the young man, more than 100 officers and soldiers began to cough uncontrollably. They covered their throats and bent down, as if they wanted to cough out their lungs. How could they care about dealing with Tang Ning and others? Tang Ning knew that the effect of the smoke would only make them uncomfortable for half an hour, but it would not be fatal. She would not kill these people just because of this small conflict. She just glanced at them and left with Xiao Xiao. After less than half an hour, someone slowly got up from the ground and cursed angrily, "Shameless, actually using poison." After the young man was helped up, his expression was extremely gloomy. He looked at the direction in which Tang Ning and others disappeared, but no one caught up with him in the end. Not to mention that a long time has passed and it is difficult to catch up with them. Even if we catch up, are they going to do this again? He turned around angrily and said in a low voice, "Go back." The group of people returned to Xianzhou city, the officers and soldiers returned to the yamen, and the young man walked into a high-ranking mansion somewhere with an unlucky look on his face. "Stop," a middle-aged man looked at him at the door and asked with a stern face, "Where have you been?" The young man waved his hand and said, "I'm going to drink." "Drinking?" The middle-aged man snorted coldly and said, "Lu governor said that you led 100 officers and soldiers out of the city, and you are becoming more and more lawless. This is Xianzhou, not Kyoto, what are you afraid of?" The young man curled his lips, and his tone suddenly became colder, and said, "Don't let me meet those people from outside the state again, next time I will let them die without burial." Place. The middle-aged man looked at him and said seriously, "From now on, please be more honest and stop causing trouble outside." The young man was about to retaliate, but suddenly he seemed to realize something. He became energetic and asked, "Is that thing true?" The middle-aged man nodded and said, "Compared with those losers, you have great hopes. Don't let the higher ups hear negative news about you." "I understand." The young man nodded repeatedly and said, "Big things come first, big things come first. From today on, I will not leave the palace. Besides Prince Jing, who else is qualified?" "Prince Jing. Prince Jing oppresses the people in the fiefdom and does all kinds of evil. If he can be the heir apparent, is it really a joke, Lord Wang? I think Prince Wei is more suitable than Prince Jing." "Nonsense, Crown Prince Yen is the best candidate." Chu State, Kyoto. Emperor Chu sat quietly on the dragon chair, with several ministers below him, arguing fiercely. The throne of the current Chu emperor came from the abdication of the late emperor. Now the emperor is in his prime and wants to sit on the throne until his old age. It is impossible to pass the throne to his brothers. But he has no princes under his knees, so he can only get it from the kings. Choose one and make him the prince. The late emperor only had one prince, and no one would have expected that the one who would inherit the throne was not the prince, but King Xian. For this reason, the children of the royal family who were enfeoffed outside the country never expected to be the emperor, so they simply took advantage of their royal status and lived a wanton and indulgent life. Many of them were infected with the habits of a dandy. Now, what these ministers need to do is to select the least dandy among these dandies. In the future, they will teach him hard to change his past mistakes, work hard to improve himself, and become a wise king. However, the emperors of the Chu state had the habit of appointing princes early, which resulted in strict requirements for the princes. Most of those who had no hope of competing for the throne gave up on themselves and just wanted to live a happy life. Therefore, among the Chu royal family, dandy men appear frequently, and it is not easy to choose a qualified prince. Emperor Chu listened to the arguments below. At a certain moment, he looked at an old man in the front and asked, "Prime Minister, who do you think is the most qualified for the position of prince?" The old man thought for a while and said, "None of the several princes can meet the requirements of the crown prince in terms of virtue or talent, but if we have to choose one with acceptable temperament, the only one is Prince Yen." You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 954. Prince Yen Wang. Emperor Chu had a thoughtful look on his face. After a moment, he nodded and said, "Let him enter the capital. The Prime Minister is right. Among the princes of the Chu royal family, the only one who is not so hopeless is Prince Yen. The position of the crown prince is not only related to the next emperor, but also has many interests involved with many officials in the court. Those who have a close relationship with King Xian are naturally happy in their hearts. As for the officials who support other princes, they will inevitably feel disappointed in their hearts. However, both the Prime Minister and His Majesty have spoken, and the matter is almost settled." At this moment, an official stepped forward and bowed, "Your Majesty, the envoys from Zioan Kingdom arrived in Kyoto yesterday. Do you want to summon them?" Xiaowan Kingdom, not only Emperor Chu, but everyone's faces showed doubts. Zioan and Kyoto are thousands of miles away, and the western regions and Chu state have never had any contact. What is the purpose of Zioan sending an envoy to Kyoto? The Prime Minister thought for a while and said, "Your Majesty, Zioan is no longer what it used to be. Although we have not established diplomatic relations before, we should not treat these envoys lightly." Emperor Chu had no intention of looking down on Zioan's envoy. Today, Zioan is no longer much weaker than Chen Chu. He must have enough respect for a big country of the same level as them. Moreover, he has never looked down upon Zioan. Even when they were a small country in the western regions, he also attached great importance to this country. In fact, many of Chu's systems were borrowed from and learned from Zioan. In addition, as an extremely proud person, he also had some admiration for the leader of Zioan kingdom. He only thought for a moment and then said, "Invite them into the palace." Several envoys from the western regions, led by two Chu officials, entered the palace. Several people walked into a large building. Mr. Su bowed his hands to the man standing above and said, "Su Ling has met His Majesty the Emperor of Chu." Several officials behind him also bowed. Emperor Chu looked at him, with a strange look on his face, and said, "It's actually Prime Minister Zioan. I have admired his name for a long time." Chu state began to intentionally learn from Zioan several years ago. Naturally, he knew more about Zioan's situation than others. Among them, the name of Prime Minister Zioan was included. This man is extremely talented, otherwise he would not have become the Prime Minister of Zioan, who even Chu state had to learn from. It was precisely because of the special status of the visitor that Emperor Chu had deep doubts about his intentions. Mr. Su raised his head and said with a smile, "Your Majesty is overly complimentary." The Emperor of Chu was curious about their purpose, and had no intention of making excuses with them. He asked, "Zioan and Chu are thousands of miles apart. The Prime Minister is here not far away. Is there something important?" Mr. Su did not beat around the bush and handed over his hand again. "To be honest with your Majesty, Su came here this time to propose marriage to your Majesty on the order of the Lord." Asking for marriage, Emperor Chu frowned slightly and asked, "Whose marriage are you asking for?" Mr. Su said, "The king of the country has admired Princess Changning for a long time. The western region is willing to work with Chu to join hands with the Qin and Jin dynasties. Su came to your country this time to represent the king of the country and ask to marry Princess Changning." As soon as he said this, he felt a little quiet inside. The Lord of Zioan is already the Lord of the western regions, and it is not inappropriate for the princess to marry him. If the Chu state can make such a powerful ally, it will be very beneficial to the future development of the Chu state. However, everyone also knows how much His Majesty dotes on this only princess. When Chen Guo proposed marriage, your Majesty did not agree, let alone the western region. Sure enough, after hearing Mr. Su's words, Emperor Chu's face immediately darkened. Could the Prime Minister be joking with me? Emperor Chu looked at him calmly and said, "Zioan was able to unify the western region step by step from a small country in 20 years. As for the leader of your country, I admire him very much in my heart, but his age should not be much different from mine, but now he says he wants to marry my daughter. Don't you think it's a little inappropriate?" Mr. Su smiled and said, "Your Majesty misunderstood, you are talking about the former king. Now, the young king has taken over the old king's position and has become the master of the western region. The young king is the same age as the princess. Similar. Zioan actually changed his master." Emperor Chu was a little surprised, and the anger in his heart disappeared. However, even if things were not what he imagined, he would not agree to it. Not to mention that Chu and Chen are friendly allies, but Ziyu and Chen are on the same page. If they agree to Ziyu's marriage proposal, wouldn't they be on the opposite side of Chen? To put it bluntly, even if Chen Guo would not be dissatisfied, his stubborn daughter would not agree. As a father, he knew very well that after a few years, she still had that person in her heart. However, the man she was thinking about was serving as prime minister in the Chen kingdom, having a wife and concubines, and was extremely happy. Every time he thought of this, he wanted to capture him from the Chen kingdom and spend 18 years on him. Such torture can alleviate the resentment in his heart. No matter what the reason was, he would not agree to the marriage proposal from the western regions. He looked at several envoys from the western regions with a calm face and said, the state of Chu is willing to live in friendly coexistence with your country, but if it does not make peace or pay tribute, it is Chu's fault. The Prime Minister no longer needs to mention the country's current national laws and marriage matters. Mr. Su sighed and said, "That's such a pity." The envoy from the western regions did not get entangled in this matter, which was beyond the expectations of Emperor Chu, but it also saved him a lot of trouble. He looked at a few people and said, "You guys have come a long way, so you might as well go back and rest until you get there. A few days ago, I personally hosted a banquet for friends from the western regions." After several people left the palace, an official looked at Mr. Su and wondered, "Su Xiang, Chu state seems to have no room for negotiation on this matter. I am afraid that the matter entrusted to us by the king this time is somewhat difficult to handle." Mr. Su shook his head, just smiled mysteriously, and said, "Don't worry, the king has his own arrangements for this matter. According to calculations, the king should be arriving soon." "What, the king has come to Chu?" Several people were shocked when they heard this and asked questions one after another. However, Mr. Su did not reveal any more information. An hour later, the princess mansion. A female official stood in front of Li Tianlan and said, "Back to the princess, the news is correct. Zioan sent an envoy to our Chu country this time to propose marriage to the princess." She glanced at Li Tianlan and quickly added, "But they were rejected by His Majesty just as they opened their mouths." "Princess, don't worry." Li Tianlan nodded and said, "I understand, you go down first." The maid responded and bowed out. After her shadow disappeared, Li Tianlan slowly walked to the window and looked at the blue sky in the distance, but there was a hint of irritation and a hint of resentment in his heart. The 3-year period has exceeded 1 year, and during this period, she only received 2 letters. The letters said that he was delayed on something important and would come as soon as he finished the matter. This delay lasted for a whole year. It is naturally impossible to say that she has no resentment in her heart, but as a princess, she can never show the image of a resentful woman in front of everyone. After a long time, she breathed a sigh of relief and suppressed the anger in her heart. At this time, a female official walked in and said, "Princess, there is a man named Tang Ning outside the mansion who wants to see you." As she finished speaking, she felt an afterimage passing before her eyes. She looked at the empty house and said in a trembling voice, "Princess, princess." Outside the princess's house, Xiao Xiao quickly ran over and hugged Ying, who came out of the house. Li Tianlan looked at her and smiled, "I haven't seen you for such a long time, and I have grown taller again." Tang Ning walked forward with a smile on her face and said, "Long time no see." Li Tianlan turned to look at him and asked calmly, "Who are you? Do we know each other?" Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 955. The smile on Tang Ning's face froze, then she smiled bitterly and said, "Don't make trouble." Li Tianlan looked at Xiao Xiao and asked, "Who is this person? Do you know Xiao Xiao?" Xiao Xiao stuck out her tongue and wisely did not get involved in the dispute between the two of them. Li Tianlan didn't even look at Tang Ning. He held her little hand and said, "Go in first." Seeing the two of them walking in hand, Tang Ning sighed. His hunch was correct. This ant was indeed angry, and very angry. This time, things would not go as smoothly as he imagined. The old beggar glanced at him and whispered, "You deserve it." Tang Ning did not refute, because he also felt that he deserved it, so he could only shake his head and follow them in. In the princess's mansion, Li Tianlan was very enthusiastic about Xiao Xiao and treated Tang Ning like nothing, without even looking at him. Xiao Xiao winked at Tang Ning, then excused herself from the long journey and went back to her room to rest. Lao Zheng also left for the same reason. Only the old beggar sat there without blinking, holding up a teapot, drinking like a thirsty man, without any intention of leaving. Tang Ning glanced at the old beggar and asked, "Aren't you sleepy?" "I'm not sleepy, Just a little thirsty. The old beggar shook his head, sat firmly on the chair, and said, "This tea is good, let me bring 2 more pots." When he finished speaking, Xiao Xiao, who had left, came back again, took his arm and said, "Master, I have a few questions to ask you. Let's come out and talk." The old beggar was dragged out by Xiao Sheng. Tang Ning walked over and closed the door. Then she walked up to Li Tianlan and said with an apology, "Lan Lan, it's all my fault for making you wait for so long." Li Tianlan looked away and said, "I don't know you, don't call me that." Tang Ning grabbed her hand and said, "If you feel uncomfortable, just hit me a few times." Li Tianlan caught his hand and shook it symbolically, and stopped struggling. Tang Ning took advantage of the situation and locked her fingers tightly. Li Tianlan's body trembled, but he stubbornly turned his head away. This made Tang Ning feel happy. Although she was still angry, it was obviously much better than when she just pretended not to recognize her. Tang Ning quickly explained, "While the iron was hot, I originally planned to come here to find you a year ago, but my mother and cousin encountered danger in the western regions. It took me 3 months to meet them. If it was just like this, you should have gone to Chu State 9 months ago." There was still some resentment in her voice, but it was much better than before. "There are some things that I didn't expect." Tang Ning shook her head and said, "After meeting my mother and cousin, I was delayed in the western region for a long time because of some things. When I returned, it was already the end of the year." Li Tianlan snorted coldly and said, "At that time, the western region was in chaos, and Zioan was annexing Daoyuzan. Can you do anything there to help Zioan unify the western region?" Tang Ning nodded and said, "I am unifying the western region, but I am not helping Zioan, because Zioan is our Zioan. I am just handling our family affairs." Li Tianlan finally looked back at him and said in shock, "Our Zioan." Tang Ning saw this face that she hadn't seen for a long time. Although it was a little haggard, it was still beautiful, and she felt a little distracted for a moment. It wasn't until Li Tianlan coughed that he came back to his senses and explained, "There is something I haven't had time to tell you yet. I am now the leader of Zioan Kingdom, and the entire western region is now controlled by Zioan." Li Tianlan showed extreme surprise on his face and asked, "How did you become the leader of Zioan Kingdom?" Tang Ning shook her head and said, "This matter is a long story. Let's talk about it slowly in the future." Thinking of something, a bright light suddenly flashed across Li Tianlan's mind, and he asked, "Did you also arrange Envoy Zioan's marriage proposal?" Tang Ning sighed and said, "You are the princess of Chu. If I didn't have a good identity, your father wouldn't marry you to me." After hearing these words, the expression on her face softened slightly, but she still snorted softly and said, "I'm afraid you made a wrong calculation. My father has already rejected Zioan's marriage proposal." Tang Ning looked at her and said, "So this matter requires your cooperation. If you say you are willing, he will not go against your decision." Thinking of the pain of missing her in the past 4 years, Li Tianlan felt a sense of grievance in his heart. He glared at Tang Ning and said, "I won't help you with this matter. Go and talk to your father yourself." Tang Ning was complaining in her heart. 4 years ago, when her father was still King Xian, she already disliked him. Tang Ning could be sure that no matter what his identity was, it could not change the fact that he stole his father-in-law's caring little cotton-padded jacket. Nor will his impression of himself change. Li Tianlan glanced at him and said, "You and I will go into the palace to see my father now." Although Tang Ning was not ready yet, how could she dare to say no at this time, so she had no choice but to follow her into the Chu palace. In a certain hall of the palace, Emperor Chu looked at Li Tianlan, who walked in, with a smile on his face, and said, "Lan Lan came just in time. Father, I have something to tell you. Just now, the envoys from the western regions wanted to propose marriage on behalf of their king. Father has already rejected it for you." As soon as he finished speaking, he saw another figure walking in behind Li Tianlan. After seeing who was coming, he was stunned for a moment, then he became furious, pointed at Tang Ning, and shouted, "Come, arrest this man for me." Tang Ning stood there, bowed helplessly, and said, "Greetings, Your Majesty." More than 10 guards had already run in. Li Tianlan waved at them, and said, "It's okay, you can go out." His Majesty and the princess gave different orders, and several people were stunned in place, looking at the Emperor Chu. The Emperor Chu looked at Li Tianlan, and finally waved his hand and said, "Forget it, you can go down first." Li Tianlan looked at Tang Ning, and the meaning was very clear. She completely handed this matter over to herself. Tang Ning had a headache, but she still bit the bullet and looked at the Emperor Chu and said, "Lanlan and I are in love, I hope Your Majesty will fulfill it." Li Tianlan blushed, secretly glared at him, but did not refute, just stood aside quietly. The king of Chu saw his daughter's expression, sighed inwardly, then regained his composure and said, "Lanlan, go out first. I have a few words to say to him alone." Li Tianlan looked at him, then at Tang Ning, and turned to walk out. After she walked out of the hall, the king of Chu looked at Tang Ning fiercely and said sternly, "You are so brave." As he finished speaking, an invisible momentum swept towards Tang Ning. Fortunately, Tang Ning has seen a lot of big battles in the past few years. His expression remained unchanged. He said, "The relationship between me and Lanlan is based on love and ends with courtesy. How can it be said to be bold?" The king of Chu said coldly, "You already have a wife, but you still dare to mess with my daughter. Isn't that bold?" He looked at Tang Ning with a sharp gaze. Without waiting for his answer, he changed his tone and said, "However, I can see that Lanlan likes you. I don't want to make her sad. As long as you are willing to divorce your wives and concubines at home and treat her wholeheartedly in the future, I will not care about your past. What do you think?" Tang Ning raised his head, looked straight at him, and shook his head, saying, "This is impossible." Outrageous, the king of Chu was furious when he heard this. "Don't think relying on Lanlan's love, you can do whatever you want. Let me tell you, just now, the Western region envoys have asked me for marriage. Do you believe that I will agree to them immediately?" Tang Ning was stunned at first, then his face turned pale, he covered his chest, and trembled, saying, "How can you do this?" The king of Chu saw his reaction, a smile appeared on his face, and said, "Think about what I said just now, otherwise, I will summon the Western region envoys to the palace now. Even if you use this as a threat, I will not give in." Tang Ning looked at him and gritted his teeth and said, "It is impossible for me to abandon my wife and children." The king of Chu was furious, "Don't think I dare not." Tang Ning looked straight at him and said, "Then you call." Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 956. Emperor Chu only used this as a threat to force Tang Ning to submit, but he never thought that he would actually marry his daughter to the western regions. However, what surprised him was that the other party refused to accept the offer. His attitude was so firm, and the atmosphere suddenly became tense. Li Tianlan walked in from outside the palace and broke the deadlock between the two. She looked up at Emperor Chu and said, "Father, I am willing to accept Xiaowen's marriage proposal." Tang Ning was secretly happy that she finally stood on her side. However, there was a sad look on his face, and he said sadly and lostly, "Lan." Emperor Chu's expression also changed. His purpose was just to make Tang Ning treat her better in the rest of her life, not to make her make a decision that she would regret for the rest of her life. Rather than letting her spend the rest of her life in regret and never being happy, it would be better to take advantage of that boy. He glanced at Tang Ning, his eyes full of deep meaning. Tang Ning understood what he meant, but she quickly looked away and did not persuade Li Tianlan as he wanted. Emperor Chu was very unhappy and could only speak again, "This matter is of great importance and is related to the relationship between the three countries. You should think about it carefully. Li Tianlan seemed to be fighting with Tang Ning, and said firmly, "No, I have already made my decision. Let's not talk about this matter for now." Emperor Chu knew that she was angry and changed the subject. "You should go to your mother and queen first. She even said she missed you this morning." After Li Tianlan left the hall, he breathed a sigh of relief. When he looked at Tang Ning, he regained his composure and said, "Come with me for a walk." Emperor Chu changed into casual clothes, and he no longer had that overbearing aura. At most, he was just a middle-aged man who looked a bit majestic. Tang Ning followed him, one position behind, and followed him to a tea house. After Emperor Chu sat down, he ordered a pot of tea, looked at Tang Ning, and asked casually, "How does it feel to be the Prime Minister?" When he no longer felt that the person in front of him was a thief who stole his daughter away from him, and looked at it purely from the perspective of an outsider, he had to admit that the radiance of his body was greater than that of the accomplished veterans in the court. Bedazzling. "I forgot." Tang Ning picked up the teacup and moistened her lips, and said, "I haven't been back to Beijing for a long time." Emperor Chu said, "Zhao Zheng is very indulgent towards you." Tang Ning said, "It's okay." Emperor Chu paused for a moment before continuing, "But I am not Zhao Zheng. I only have one daughter. In the past few years, looking at her appearance, I wish I could send someone to capture you and punish you in all kinds of ways, use them all again. But I can't do that." Emperor Chu glanced at him with a sharp look and said, "That will make Lanlan sad. I don't want her to be sad, and I don't want you to make her sad." "It won't happen again," Tang Ning solemnly promised. "You have already made her sad." Emperor Chu put down the teacup heavily and said, "If not, how could she agree to Xiaowen's marriage proposal?" Emperor Chu was not fooled just now. Tang Ning originally planned to tell the truth, but after hearing what he just said, things seemed to be turning around, so she wisely kept silent. Emperor Chu looked at him for a long time, then picked up the teacup and spoke again, "I don't want to pursue the past matters anymore, but Lan, I can't watch her go to the western regions. You have to persuade her to change her mind. I don't care what you do after this." Unexpectedly, happiness would come so suddenly. Tang Ning immediately nodded, "Don't worry, I will give her some good advice." Emperor Chu's expression softened, he put down his teacup, stood up and left the tea house. Tang Ning followed him. At a certain moment, Emperor Chu suddenly spoke. Xiaowen came suddenly this time, and her intention to form an alliance with the Chu state was obvious. The reason behind it must not be that simple. Their purpose is most likely Chen state. If the western regions and the Chu state join forces, the Chen state will be destroyed within a year. When you return to the country this time, you must be extra careful with the western regions. Emperor Chu was not surprised to think of this. The relationship between Xiaowen and Chen Guo was so tense. At this moment, he wanted to marry Chen Guo's ally Chu state. This purpose was too obvious, even for someone without any political sense. They can all figure it out. Only Tang Ning and a few others knew that the purpose of Xiao Wan's mission to the Chu state was actually very simple, just to seek marriage on the surface. But except for Tang Ning and Mr. Su, I'm afraid no one will believe it. Tang Ning did not explain to him, but nodded and said, "I understand." Seeing that his words did not attract enough attention from him, Emperor Chu frowned and said again, "The king of Xiaowen is a powerful man with great talents and great strategy. His son must not be mediocre. Xiaowen has been coveting Chen Guo. Soon, they have unified the western region, and their next target must be Chen state, so don't be careless." Tang Ning's expression became solemn, indicating that she had been taught a lesson, and then she added, "Maybe the new leader of Xiaowen kingdom is a good and peace-loving man who is unwilling to start a war." Emperor Chu snorted coldly and said, "I don't know if he is a good person, but he must be a pervert." Tang Ning lost her footing and almost fell down. After regaining her balance, she no longer asked for trouble. It doesn't matter if the father-in-law has figured it out, he doesn't need to reveal his identity. It would be best if he can take Lanlan away quietly, and it can also avoid a lot of unnecessary trouble. However, many things in this world are not what people want. Tang Ning and Chu Huang were walking on the street. They glanced at each other inadvertently and saw two people approaching from a distance. Although Tang Ning was not familiar with these two people, she had met them several times in the court. They were not in the western region, but appeared here. They should be envoys brought here by Mr. Su. Tang Ning was 2 steps behind Emperor Chu, gesturing to them from a distance to tell them not to come. However, when the two of them saw him, they didn't know whether they had misunderstood him or something. Their expressions clearly straightened, and then they lowered their heads. Walked over quickly. Emperor Chu also noticed the two people in front of him. The guards around him were about to make a move. Emperor Chu recognized that these two people were Xiaowen's envoys and waved his hand to stop the guards around him. However, this was on the street, and he didn't want to reveal his identity, so he made a gesture to the two of them, telling them to keep quiet. However, the two of them didn't look at him at all. They walked past him, bowed to Tang Ning, and said, "I see the king." Tang Ning could already feel the change in Emperor Chu's expression. She looked at the two of them with a look of astonishment on her face and said, "What king? You have recognized the wrong person." Country. One of the envoys had a look of doubt on his face, and just as he was about to speak, another man tugged on his sleeve, an apologetic look appeared on his face, and said, "I'm sorry, we got the wrong person, please, no, please don't be offended." Then, he quickly turned around, saluted Emperor Chu, and said, "I have met your majesty. I just saw this young man who looks very similar to the lord of the kingdom. I was a little rude for a moment. Please forgive me." Another person also said hurriedly, "Your majesty, please forgive me." Tang Ning looked at Emperor Chu and said with a smile, "They got the wrong person." Emperor Chu looked at him expressionlessly and said, "How long do you plan to pretend?" You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 957. Chu State Imperial Palace, Imperial Study Room. Mr. Su and others stood quietly below. Emperor Chu sat on the main seat, and Tang Ning sat on his left. Although he didn't want to admit it, as the Lord of Xiaowen and the Lord of the Western region, Tang Ning already had the qualifications to be on an equal footing with him. It wasn't until this moment that he realized why this kid had angered him again and again when he pretended to let his daughter marry the Lord of Xiaowen. Thinking of how he had almost deceived him by pretending to be sad just now, Emperor Chu felt an unknown fire in his heart. If he really agreed to Xiaowen's marriage proposal, wouldn't he still be advantaged in vain? What he couldn't accept even more was that his daughter actually joined forces with this boy to lie to him. Emperor Chu looked at Tang Ning and said in a serious tone, "You have a good plan." Tang Ning smiled and said, "I am the leader of the Western regions, and so is Tang Ning. No matter who I am, my feelings for Lan Lan will not change." After hearing this, the expression on Emperor Chu's face softened slightly. He glanced at Tang Ning and said, "Don't think that since you are the leader of Xiaowen Kingdom, I will marry my daughter to you easily." Although he said that, he felt much more comfortable after knowing Tang Ning's identity. How unbecoming is it for a majestic princess of the Chu state to marry an official of the Chen state as a concubine? However, if he were the lord of the Western region, the meaning would be different. This is a real match, and it does not insult the majesty of the Chu royal family. Tang Ning looked at him and said, "No matter what, I will never give up." Thinking that his daughter's elbow had turned outwards and that the matter was irreversible, Emperor Chu looked at him and said, "It's okay to ask Lanlan to marry you, but she must be Xiaowen's mother." Tang Ning was stunned for a moment, then shook her head and said, "This won't work." Snapped. Emperor Chu slapped the table and said, "Don't push yourself too far." Emperor Chu was undoubtedly much more difficult to deal with than rich man Tang, but on this matter, Tang Ning could not give in even a step. Unable to reach an agreement on key issues, the negotiation ended unhappily. Tang Ning had been mentally prepared for this. After leaving the palace, he did not return to the princess mansion, nor did he make any arrangements for him at the Chu state court. Instead of settling in his own place, he found a random inn in the city. Not long after, Li Tianlan opened the door to his room, walked in from the outside, and said, "I will persuade my father." Tang Ning held her hand and said, "It's my fault for making you wait for so long." Li Tianlan sat down next to him and said, "Tell me, what has happened around you in the past 2 years?" Tang Ning thought for a while and said, "There are so many things that happened, I don't know where to start." Li Tianlan said, "You married the third wife and the fourth wife in the past 2 years. How many wives do you have now?" All of her questions hit her heart. Tang Ning could imagine that after taking her back to Gizhu, with her temperament, she would definitely have a fierce conflict with Fairy Tang. If Su Mei was added to the mix, even Tang Ning himself didn't know what kind of embarrassing situation he would face. Fortunately, he has not improved much in other areas over the years, but his ability to coax girls has improved steadily after countless trials. Even so, it took Tang Ning 3 full days to get rid of the last bit of resentment in her heart. In the past few days, Emperor Chu did not look for him. Because in recent days, the Chu court has been busy with a big event. The original King Xin only had one daughter, which resulted in the current His Majesty having only one princess. The queen was infertile and he had no idea of having a concubine. Under such circumstances, the choice of the next emperor of the Chu kingdom became very important. Big question. The state of Chu was much more active than the state of Chen in establishing a crown prince. In order to prevent the princes from fighting each other, the Chu state would establish a prince very early. Therefore, even if the current Chu emperor is in his prime, he must implement the crown prince position as soon as possible. The emperor has no heirs. This kind of thing has happened in history. The solution is to pass it on to his brothers or select an heir from the royal family. The emperor of Chu would be emperor for many more years. Naturally, the throne could not be passed on to his brothers. Instead, he chose one from among his nephews. Tang Ning heard a lot of people talking about this matter these days. It was said that the one who was finally selected was Prince Yen. Prince Yen was the half-brother of Emperor Chu. He left Kyoto and went to the fiefdom decades ago. But he would not have expected that he would not be destined for the throne, but would one day sit on the throne of the Supreme Emperor. I heard that Prince Yen came to Kyoto yesterday, and if nothing unexpected happens, his canonization ceremony will be held within this year. Who will inherit the throne of Chu kingdom has nothing to do with Tang Ning. When the emperor of Chu is finished with these things, he will probably think of him soon. Tang Ning stayed in the inn, bored, so she went out with Xiao Xiao for a walk. Halfway through the stroll, Tang Ning suddenly seemed to remember something. She turned to look at Lao Zheng behind her and asked, "Didn't you say that you met a master here and you wanted to get back on your feet this time? Have you beaten him yet?" He didn't originally plan to ask Lao Zheng to come with him this time, but he took the initiative to ask for a companion, and Tang Ning did not refuse. It's just that he is a little curious about Lao Zheng. Except for Wan Yanyan's master and the old beggar, he rarely takes others seriously, let alone admits that he is slightly inferior. Lao Zheng shook his head and said, "I didn't find it." Tang Ning felt that it was just an excuse. His purpose was just to come to Chu with them. It must be said that as a guard, Lao Zheng's diligence was enough to make most of his colleagues ashamed. Xiao Xiao took Tang Ning's arm and said, "Let's go to the grandmother's place to eat noodles. The grandmother's noodles are delicious." Hearing their conversation, Lao Zheng, who was limping behind Tang Ning, couldn't help but frown. Speaking of which, Tang Ning hadn't eaten the grandmother's noodles for 4 years. Hearing this, he was also tempted and said, "Let's go. I miss the grandmother's noodles." The three of them came to the noodle stall, but didn't see the grandmother outside. The owner of the nearby shop said that he had just fought with an old beggar. The grandmother cooked noodles well and had a bad temper. She was a bully in Beijing. The ruffians in the whole capital had to go around her when they saw her. Although the two were disappointed, they could only go back to the inn first. Tang Ning was about to leave when a commotion suddenly came from the street ahead. The people ran to the sides of the street and stood against the wall, leaving the main street. A group of people walked on the street and slowly came here. The leader was a few young people, dressed luxuriously and with extraordinary demeanor. They were from a powerful family. The young man walking in front looked familiar to Tang Ning. After a little thought, he remembered that he was the young man who had a conflict with them in Xianzhou because he entangled Xiao Xiao. Xiao Xiao obviously recognized this person, tugged at Tang Ning's sleeve, and whispered, "Why is it him?" In the crowd, the young man listened to the flattery of the people around him, and his heart was floating. He glanced inadvertently and suddenly saw a few familiar figures in the crowd. His footsteps paused, and his face seemed to be burning again. His face sank at first, and then he sneered, "What a coincidence! Fortunate young gentleman." Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 958. A few days ago, the impression of the powerful officials in the capital on the Prince of Xian was nothing more than a royal child who was just eating and waiting to die. He was far away in Xianzhou and had no intersection with them. However, things are different now. A sparrow can also fly up to the branch and become a phoenix. The current Prince of Xian will be the prince in a few days. Although it is still early for him to become the emperor, it will not be wrong to curry favor with him in advance. Therefore, after he arrived in the capital, countless followers gathered around him immediately. Several people noticed the abnormality of the Prince of Xian at the same time. A young man next to him looked at him and asked, "Prince, what's wrong?" The Prince of Xian had a gloomy face. Not long ago, he was beaten by several passers-by. It was the biggest humiliation he had suffered in his life. However, a great piece of good news hit him on the head, making him almost forget about it. Unexpectedly, he saw them again in Kyoto today. The Prince of Xian almost subconsciously took 2 steps in that direction, and then his footsteps suddenly stopped. Although he was a newcomer and had no power in Kyoto, it was not difficult for him to embarrass a few passers-by with his current status. As long as he showed a little interest, people would rush to do it for him. However, he was still a little hesitant. Although he defeated those opponents, there were still countless eyes on him in Kyoto. As long as he made a mistake, those people would never miss the opportunity to take advantage of him. This was a sensitive period. Before the matter was completely settled, he had better keep a low profile. So he suppressed the hatred in his heart, shook his head and smiled at a few people, nothing. At this moment, Tang Ning also learned the identity of the young man from passers-by. These people went out with such a large force, and the people had already talked about it. Tang Ning did not expect that the young man who clashed with them in Xianzhou was actually the Prince of Xian, the crown prince selected by the Chu court. The crown prince of a country was actually like a gangster, which was also a characteristic of the Chu royal family. The state of Chu had appointed a crown prince early on, and those royal children knew that they had no hope of becoming the crown prince, so they might as well be free and easy and live a happy life. What surprised Tang Ning was that the Prince of Xian also recognized them. He had been planning to come over to find trouble, but for some reason, he stopped. This made the plan that had just come up in his mind stranded in an instant. So he looked at the Prince of Xian again, and when he found that he was also looking at him, he slowly raised his hand and raised a middle finger to him. The Prince of Xian had been planning to leave, but suddenly saw Tang Ning's action. Although he didn't understand the meaning of the action, combined with his expression, it must not have a good meaning. Unexpectedly, he was planning to endure it, but the other party was still so arrogant. His face became completely gloomy, his fists clenched, and his eyes stared at Tang Ning. The young man beside him looked forward, and when he looked back, he looked at him in surprise and asked, "Does the prince have a grudge against that man?" Prince Yen nodded and said, "This man is extremely arrogant. This prince and he have had a grudge before. Is there any way to make him suffer? These people in the capital have long wanted to make Prince Yen owe them a favor, but they have no way." The young man looked at Prince Yen, secretly happy, nodded, and said, "Prince, don't worry, I will take care of this matter." Tang Ning saw that those people did not continue to move forward, but entered a tea house. His eyes looked over here from time to time, and he knew that his provocation just now worked, and a smile appeared on his face. If it were someone else, he would not be so boring, but everyone knew that Prince Yen was the crown prince appointed by the court. Since a few days ago, his actions have represented the court of Chu. Xiao Xiao looked up at Tang Ning and saw that he had a strange expression. She suddenly asked, "Brother, what bad idea are you thinking of again? How can you talk like that?" Tang Ning nodded on her forehead, sat down on the street, and said, "We'll wait for Grandma to come back here." Tang Ning did not wait for Grandma who was selling noodles, but waited for a team of yamen runners. 50 yamen runners with knives surrounded them. The leading constable looked at them and said loudly, "I suspect you are related to a murder case. Come with us to the Ministry of Justice." Tang Ning stood up, smiled at him, and said, "Let's go." The constable was shocked and stood there for a while. He just followed the instructions of the young master, made up a crime at random, and took these people to the Ministry of Justice. What happened afterwards had nothing to do with him. What is the Ministry of Justice? It is a hell that terrifies countless people. However, the person in front of him, after hearing that he was going to the Ministry of Justice, was not only not panicked or afraid, but also smiled at him. Although this smile was kind, it was a bit chilling in his eyes. For a moment, he felt a little unsure. He originally planned to put shackles on them first, but now he was a little hesitant. At this time, Tang Ning looked at him again and asked, "How do I get to the Ministry of Justice?" "Lead the way." This constable has also arrested many dignitaries and officials. Even those who are in high positions are panicked and cry before going to the Ministry of Justice. He has never met such a calm and composed person, as if he was just going to the Ministry of Justice for fun. He even had an illusion that this person seemed to be waiting for them to show up. This made him even more unsure. He glanced at a few of his men and whispered, "Go back to the yamen." Watching the officials from the Ministry of Punishment leading Tang Ning and the others away, in the tea house not far away, the young man looked at Prince Yen and asked with a smile, "Your Majesty, do you want to go to the Ministry of Punishment?" The Crown Prince stood up with a smile on his face and said, "If nothing happens, let's go and take a look." The Xingbu Yamen is not far from the noodle stall, otherwise these Yamen servants would not have arrived so quickly. Tang Ning was taken to the Penal Department Yamen. She looked around and found that the regulations here were similar to those of the Chengguo Penal Department Yamen. When the police officer saw that he had arrived at the criminal department, the man was still not panicked. Instead, he had the intention to look left and right, his heart pounding. At this time, when he saw a person walking out of the yamen, his expression straightened and he immediately bowed and said, "I have met Master Shangshu." The Minister of Punishment was about to enter the palace to report something, but he just waved his hand and was about to leave. He is one of the few people who knows that the leader of the Zioan kingdom is in Kyoto. After unifying the western regions, Zioan is already on par with the Chu kingdom in terms of national structure. Imagine what the Chu kingdom will do if Emperor Chen comes to the Chu kingdom. This is how the leader of Zioan kingdom should be treated. Once the leader of Zioan state makes a mistake in Chu state, the face of the entire Chu state will be lost, and no one can bear this responsibility. But the monarch's temperament was obviously a bit strange. He refused to stay at Honglu Temple and just lived in an ordinary inn. His Majesty even ignored this, which was really inappropriate. Even if King Zioan insists, they should make some arrangements around the inn to avoid something unpleasant happening to him. He came to the palace this time to suggest this matter. He was about to leave the criminal department when he suddenly stopped and looked at a figure in the crowd. After a moment of confusion, he immediately walked over quickly, bowed and said, "The king has arrived, and I am not far away to welcome you." The head catcher looked at Lord Shangshi groveling in front of this man, and his whole body felt as if he had been struck by lightning, and his face instantly turned pale. After the Minister of Punishment saluted, he looked at Tang Ning in surprise and asked, "The Lord has come to the punishment ministry, but what's the matter?" Tang Ning smiled, looked at the government officials, and said, "I'll have to ask them now." Plop. After several muffled sounds, several government officials had collapsed on the ground. Although the remaining people could barely stand, their legs were trembling and their faces were frighteningly pale. The face of the Minister of Justice changed. He looked at Tang Ning and murmured, "This." Tang Ning looked at the Minister of Punishment, his face darkened, and said, "I also want to ask, how come we have become suspects in a murder case after being in Kyoto for only a few days? If your Chu country doesn't give an explanation to its leader, Zioan will never give up." Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 959. Looking at Tang Ning's gloomy face, cold sweat began to seep out of the Minister of Justice's forehead. The one who was arrested by the Ministry of Justice was not someone else, but the Lord of the Western Regions, who was of the same status as their Majesty. Not to mention that he was very likely framed. Even if he was really involved in a murder case, it was not something the Ministry of Justice could handle. He wiped the cold sweat from his forehead, looked at Tang Ning, and smiled, "My lord, please calm down. I will definitely investigate this matter and give you an explanation." After that, he looked at the head of the police, his face sank, and he said angrily, "Tell me, what is going on?" This matter was not something he could handle, and he couldn't suppress it. The only thing he could do was to find out the whole story before His Majesty sentenced him. The head constable knelt on the ground with a plop, and said in a trembling voice, "Yes, it's the young master." The Prince of Xian and his entourage came to the Ministry of Justice. A young man walked up, looked at the yamen runners of the Ministry of Justice, and asked, "Where is the person who was arrested just now?" The constable said, "In the Shangshu yamen." "No way." The young man showed a look of surprise on his face. "This matter even alarmed my father." The constable looked up at him, then quickly lowered his head and said, "The master asked the young master to go to the Shangshu yamen as well." The young man's face was still suspicious, and he was uneasy when he walked towards the Shangshu yamen. If his father knew that he used the yamen runners of the Ministry of Justice to seek personal gain, he would definitely not have a good result. But fortunately, the Prince of Xian was also involved in today's matter. This person was a big shot who really wanted to curry favor with him, and he should turn a blind eye. He walked into the Shangshu yamen, looked up, and a chill rushed from the coccyx to the brain, and the whole person shivered. In the Shangshu yamen, the head of the Ministry of Justice, his father, whom he was extremely afraid of, stood below with his hands hanging down, while the young man who was arrested by him and taken to the Ministry of Justice sat steadily in the main seat, drinking the good tea that even his father was reluctant to drink. If he had not seen the emperor before, he would have thought that the other party was the emperor. "Rebellious son, kneel down." The roar of the Minister of Justice made the young man's body tremble, and he knelt on the ground without hesitation. Even his father had to stand in front of that man, so how could he dare to resist at all? The Minister of Justice glared at him and said angrily, "Why don't you apologize to the king?" "King," the young man was in fear, and a trace of astonishment appeared on his face when he heard the words. He blurted out, "What king?" The Minister of Justice stepped forward, slapped him on the head, and said angrily, "This is the king of Zion. What happened just now? Tell me the truth." "Xiao, king of Zion." The young man trembled again, and looked at Tang Ning with fear. The unified western regions were no less than their Chu state, and he had just brought the king of Zion to the Ministry of Justice. What was the difference between this and him having someone arrest His Majesty? In just a moment, he clearly realized that this matter was definitely not something he could bear. The next moment, he immediately said, "It's His Royal Highness." The Prince of Xian, who was standing outside the door and eavesdropping, shook his body, his face was gloomy, and he cursed in his mouth. He never thought that the passerby who had a conflict with him was actually the king of Zion. Why did the king of Zion come to Chu state instead of staying in the western regions? He cursed the son of the Minister of Justice in his heart, but he was unwilling to stay in the Ministry of Justice any longer, so he turned around and walked out with a gloomy face. When he returned to his temporary residence in Kyoto, King Xian saw that he looked unhappy and asked, "What happened? It's really unlucky." The Prince of King Xian waved his hand and said, "I accidentally provoked the king of Zion." "What?" King Xian's face changed drastically when he heard this, and asked, "How did you offend him?" He had just received the news that the king of Zion came to Chu state. In less than an hour, his son actually provoked him. Prince Xian glanced at him and said, "It's just a small country in the western regions." "Father, why are you making such a fuss? You are so arrogant." Prince Xian pointed at him and said angrily, "It's just a small country in the western regions. Do you know that Zion has unified the western regions? Their ruler is the same as your majesty. Not to mention that you are not the emperor yet. Even if you really become the emperor, you are not qualified to say that just now." Prince Xian's face turned gloomy and asked, "Then what should I do?" Prince Xian pointed at him and finally just waved his hand and said, "Tell me, how did you offend him?" "The matter involving the ruler of Zion is the matter of Chu and the western regions. Even a small matter will become a big deal. After the unification, Zion is so powerful that even Chu dare not underestimate it. Establishing diplomatic relations with Zion is a major event that is beneficial to the country. At this time, if he offended the ruler of Zion and destroyed the diplomatic relations between the two countries, he would have to apologize to the people of the country. Even if he is the future prince, he cannot bear such a responsibility." The Prince of Xian finally realized the seriousness of the matter. His expression changed and he told the whole story of his grievances with the ruler of Zion, including the fact that when he was in Xianzhou, he fell in love with the woman next to the ruler of Zion and mobilized the Xianzhou garrison to besiege them. After listening to this, the king of Xian swayed, and stood up with the help of a chair. He looked at him with a sad and angry look, and gritted his teeth and said, "Flirting with concubine Zion, besieging and killing the king of Zion, is there anything else you dare not do?" The Prince of Xian was also very aggrieved. If he had known that the man was the king of Zion, he would not have offended him. After all, in his eyes, nothing was more important than his throne. If he lost the throne that he should have gotten because of this incident, he would definitely regret it to death. His face gradually turned pale, and he looked at King Xian and asked, "Father, His Majesty will not stop me from being the crown prince because of this matter, right?" "I don't know." King Xian shook his head irritably, and seeing his face getting paler, he added, "But I don't think it will be that serious. After all, they chose you with great difficulty. If you regret it again, what will happen to the credibility of the court and His Majesty?" The Prince of King Xian felt relieved, and then said indignantly, "He is so young, who would have thought that he is the ruler of Zion?" "Enough." King Xian glanced at him and said, You should wait and see what happens in this matter. After all, His Majesty and I are a family. He will not be cruel to you for an outsider. In the palace, in a hall somewhere, the king of Chu took the memorial handed over by the Minister of Justice in his hand and put it on the table with a gloomy face. He snorted coldly and said, "This is the crown prince we chose." Tang Ning stood aside expressionlessly. If the king of Chu agreed to his marriage with Lan Lan, then he would be his father-in-law, and he would naturally treat him as a junior. But if he didn't agree, he would just be the king of Chu. With Tang Ning's current status, there was no need to be polite to him. Tang Ning looked at him and said, "Your country's future crown prince flirted with my princess Xiaoan and falsely accused me of assassinating the king. I think your majesty should give me an explanation for this matter." From Xiaoan's perspective, this matter is naturally not a trivial matter, and it is normal for the king of Xiaoan to have such an attitude. But he is not only the king of Xiaoan, but also the heartthrob who stole the heart of his precious daughter. When these words came out of his mouth, the king of Chu was very unhappy. "Give you an explanation," he looked at Tang Ning, snorted coldly, and said, "How about I give Lan Lan to you?" You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 960. Chapter 955, Huang Liangyim and Tang Ning originally thought that she would have to deal with twists and turns with him for a long time, but she didn't expect Emperor Chu to be so straightforward, which actually made him a little embarrassed. When Emperor Chu saw that he actually showed an emotional expression, his face suddenly darkened and he said, "Sure enough, this is your purpose. Have you already settled everything?" Tang Ning's expression became serious and she asked, "Your Majesty is joking, do you think I can bribe your would-be prince to cooperate with me in this play?" After he finished speaking, another smile appeared on his face and he said, "However, the prince and quasi-prince of your country have the same virtue. This matter is due to a breach of etiquette in our country of Chu." Emperor Chu glanced at him and asked, "What do you, Xiaoan, want to explain?" Tang Ning looked at him and said, "It all depends on Chu State's sincerity." Emperor Chu snorted coldly and asked, "What if Chu State is not sincere?" Tang Ning said, "Then Xiaoan won't give up." A sneer appeared on Emperor Chu's face, and he said, "I want to see how you can't give up." Tang Ning looked at the suddenly tough Emperor Chu, thought for a moment, and asked, "Don't you regret it, and want to use our Xiaoan to mess up the future prince's affairs?" Put yourself in his shoes. If he were the Emperor of Chu, he would not want to hand over the country that he had finally stabilized to such a person. But Jun Wuxi said that he himself could not retract this decision for no reason, but if the matter was made a big deal through Xiaoan's hands, it would be logical for him to retract the holy order at the same time. After Tang Ning exposed his thoughts, Emperor Chu's expression remained unchanged and he said, "Do you think I would use such a clumsy method?" No, although Tang Ning felt that it was true in her heart, when she said it now, he would probably become angry and had to say, "But I will not give up Lan Lan. If you don't agree, I will not leave Chu country for a day." Emperor Chu glanced at him and asked, "You don't want the western region anymore?" Tang Ning said, "If I have to make a choice between western region and Lanlan, I choose Lanlan." Outside the hall, after hearing his words, a figure standing in front of the window had a smile on his face. Emperor Chu glanced at him, was silent for a long time, and then said, "Since you like Lanlan so much, it would seem wrong of me if I disagree. However, I have a condition. If you don't agree, this matter will also no need to mention it again." Having reached this point, Tang Ning naturally would not give up and immediately asked, "What are the conditions?" Emperor Chu said, "The first son you two give birth to must be named Li. After he is 3 years old, he will be brought to me." Tang Ning looked at him with wide eyes and asked, "What do you mean?" Emperor Chu looked at him and said, "Since the Chu royal family does not have a talented heir, I will cultivate one myself." How could she bear to let her own son stay away from her? Tang Ning looked at Emperor Chu and suggested, "Why don't you give birth to one by yourself? You are now in your prime, so powerful." Emperor Chu glared at her, causing Tang Ning to swallow her next words. He looked at Emperor Chu's expression and knew that if he didn't agree to this matter, he would be determined not to get his wish. He thought for a while and said, "This is not my matter alone. I need to discuss it with Lanlan." Emperor Chu gave an order, and Li Tianlan arrived here quickly. Although the two argued hard, Emperor Chu remained unmoved. They tried their best to extend the 3-year period to 5 years, but he refused to retreat at all. In desperation, Tang Ning could only agree. What would happen in 5 years was still uncertain, so she had to agree first and pass the current hurdle. After finalizing this matter, the relationship between Tang Ning and Emperor Chu immediately eased. Emperor Chu not only welcomed him with a smile, but even allowed him to eat in the palace. The new mother-in-law looked at him very strangely. After all, the last time she saw him, he was just a minor official in the Chen kingdom. When we met again after a few years, he was already the leader of the Zioan kingdom, one of the few in this continent. Many people stand at the pinnacle of power. When Emperor Chu was halfway through eating, he put down his chopsticks and asked, "Now that you are the leader of the Zioan kingdom, how do you plan to treat the Chen kingdom?" Tang Ning said, "The people of both countries long for peace. The hostile relationship between Zioan and Chen is in the past." Emperor Chu nodded and asked again, "Are you going back to Chen kingdom?" Tang Ning smiled and said, "I have to go back. There are some things that need to be dealt with." Li Tianlan glanced at him cryptically, but did not reveal it. Emperor Chu picked up the chopsticks again and said, "Today is no better than in the past, so be careful when you go back." The queen glanced at him and asked, "Even if this child is in Chen state, he is still a general and prime minister. Why should he be careful? When all the birds are gone, good bows are hidden." Emperor Chu said, "After the grassland is stabilized, the western region has become the last enemy of Chen state. Without foreign enemies, Zhao Zhen no longer needs any powerful general." Tang Ning nodded and said, "I will be careful." In fact, he had already expected that there would be some unpleasantness between him and Emperor Chen when he returned to Chen kingdom this time. Even if the bow is not hidden after the bird is killed, what the Emperor Chen wants is that Tang Ning stays in Chen state and continues to assist the next emperor. This is contrary to Tang Ning's idea. If Tang Ning does not obey his arrangement, he will not let Tang Ning take Zhao Man away easily. If it is not for the other gains from this trip to the western regions, it will still be a bit troublesome for him to take Zhao Man away when he returns to Chen state this time. The meal was a happy one. Before leaving, the Emperor of Chu called Tang Ning and gave him a look. Tang Ning waved his hand and said, "Don't worry, leave it to me." Two major events have happened in Kyoto recently. One is that His Majesty and the court have selected the candidate for the crown prince. The Prince of Xian has come to Beijing and will be enthroned as the prince soon. The second thing is still related to the Prince of Xian. When the Prince of Xian was in Xianzhou, he flirted with Princess Zioan and surrounded and killed the King of Zioan. After arriving in the capital, he framed the King of Zioan and arrested him in the Ministry of Justice. He was so bold. The king and princess were insulted in Chu. The envoys of Zioan were furious and chased the court of Chu to ask for an explanation, which made the officials of Chu very worried. Today, Zioan is already a big country that is not inferior to Chu. Any small contradiction may erupt into a national conflict. At the same time, there were some different voices in both the people and the court. The future prince of Chu was so bad in character. Would the country be handed over to such a person in the future? Some people and officials jointly wrote to the court and begged His Majesty not to treat the future of the country as a joke and to withdraw the order of canonization. Your Majesty has always taken public opinion into consideration and quickly discussed the result with the ministers. As a member of the royal family, the Prince of Sian was bold and lawless, which seriously hurt the feelings of friendly countries. The Prince of Sian failed to discipline him and had an unshirkable responsibility. From then on, he was demoted to a county prince. At the same time, the Prince of Sian was also deprived of his qualifications as a crown prince. From now on, he will be sent back to his fiefdom and cannot come to the capital without being summoned. Inside the hall, the Prince of Sian knelt on the ground, his face pale and expressionless. His position as crown prince came suddenly, but it turned out to be a dream. He knelt there blankly with the imperial edict in his hand, as if his soul had been taken away. Fortunate young gentleman author, Wrong Xiao Wrong. Chapter 961. Chapter 956 of the main text of Ruyi Xiaolang Jun. The crown prince arrived in Beijing only 3 days before he was sent back again. His dream of being a prince and an emperor was missed in vain because of his own stupidity. Chance. Although the imperial court and His Majesty had some suspicions of changing the order at night, the envoy Xiaowen really pressed too hard on this matter and forced the imperial court and His Majesty to give them an explanation. The reason why this incident had such a big impact and caused His Majesty to withdraw his life was all because of Xiaowen. But if we put ourselves in their shoes, if His Majesty was subjected to such a shameful humiliation in Xiaowen, the reaction of the people and officials of Chu state would probably be even greater. If Prince Yen was not severely punished, Xiaowen would definitely not give up. Now Xiaowen is not someone to be trifled with. In order to appease their anger, His Majesty finally made such a decision, which was not unexpected. Prince Yen became the laughing stock. I thought the opportunity would fall to the other princes, but His Majesty did not mention this matter at all. It's right to think about it. Such a scandal has occurred in the court and the royal family. Your Majesty must be extra cautious when choosing a prince. If such a thing happens again, wouldn't it be a joke to outsiders? While the people in Beijing were talking about this matter, Tang Ning and Li Tianlan were eating noodles in the mother-in-law's noodle shop. Others said that Xiaowen was the crux of the matter regarding Prince Yen, but they didn't know that Xiaowen was the one who took the blame. They demanded an explanation so strongly, but in fact they were just asking for an explanation from Emperor Chu. At this time, the noodle seller's mother-in-law was not outside. Tang Ning had known before that he was actually Li Tianlan's master, and she had taught her all the martial arts. The old woman and the old beggar have been inseparable lately, and they will fight each other whenever there is a chance. However, they have fought so many times, but they still have no chance of winning. The old noodle seller was obviously a rival of the same level as the old beggar, but Lao Zhen was a little behind them. Li Tianlan and Xiao Xiao had to move to the next level again. Tang Ning gave Li Tianlan a poached egg in the bowl. Although it was a little difficult to coax her during this trip to Chu, fortunately everything was safe. Tang Ning originally thought that Emperor Chu would quietly marry the princess to Xiaowen, but what she didn't expect was that he would publicize the matter in a big way. Chu state is Chen state's ally, and Xiaowen is Chen state's enemy, at least for now. Tang Ning didn't know how Chen Huang would feel when he heard about the marriage between an ally and an enemy country, but she would definitely not bless him. Obviously, for Chu state, their friendship with Chen state is just a plastic brotherhood. They have been oppressed by Chen state for so many years and suffered all kinds of exploitation. How could they not have resentment in their hearts? Maybe this time, he just wanted to use this incident to express his years of resentment. After all, the Chu state is no longer what it used to be. They no longer need to be controlled by the Chen state. Their biggest enemy, the grassland Wanyan tribe, has also reached a reconciliation with them. The Chu state is about to enter a period of barbaric growth, and naturally they no longer need to be controlled by the Chen state. The bird spirit of the country. Tang Ning couldn't help but worry about whether Chen Huang could withstand this sudden blow with his cautious mind and his current body. The Chu state was so tough this time, completely ignoring Chen state's feelings. The biggest reason was that their enemies had now become friends and there were no more foreign troubles. Speaking of which, since Wanyanyan came to power, the grassland has completely said goodbye to that kind of predatory development. They began to cooperate with Chen Chu to achieve win-win business. However, the black barbarians who pose the greatest threat to them are in the process of splitting and temporarily threatening them. Without them, the lives of the grassland people have become easier in the past 2 years. Thinking of this, Tang Ning realized that the original 3-year period with Wanyanyan had passed by for another 2 years, and now there was only 1 year left. If Li Tianlan is still rational, Xiao Maniu doesn't care about the consequences when doing things. Tang Ning felt that if he dared to break the contract for 1 day, Wanyan's army would probably attack Chen State directly. When you eat noodles with such thoughts, the originally delicious food becomes tasteless. Tang Ning inadvertently raised her head and saw a group of people hurriedly walking through the street. Judging from their clothes and appearance, they must be from the prairie. 3 years ago, the grassland people would not have dared to show up in Chu State so brazenly. Now that the two countries have reconciled, it is not surprising to see the Sushan people in Chu State's Kyoto. However, what Tang Ning thought was an ordinary thing was actually unusual. Only when he returned to his residence did he hear Mr. Su say that deep in the grassland, the black barbarians had put down the civil strife and reunified. The Wanyan tribe, which was also on the grassland, would face the threat of the black barbarians again. Although the current Wanyan division, with Chen Chu's support, is even more powerful than 2 years ago, Hyman is known for its bravery, and they will not get any benefit at all from this war. Grassland sent people to Chu State this time to move reinforcements. Compared with Chen State, Chu State is closer to the grassland and can provide them with the most timely support. Tang Ning looked at Mr. Su and asked, "What did the Chu State court say?" Mr. Su said, "The ministers are discussing it, and the specific results are not yet known." When Tang Ning arrived at the palace, the Chu State's temporary court meeting had ended. The court was divided into 2 groups. One group believed that the Wanyan tribe should be supported. The black barbarians were a truly barbaric race. If the Wanyan tribe was conquered by them, their next target must be Chu State. By then, Chu's situation will become even more dangerous than it was a few years ago. Others insisted that although Hyman was powerful, the Sushan people were not vegetarians. If they wanted to eat Waini umbu, Hyman would have to pay a huge price. At that time, only if the Chu state takes action can the interests be maximized. There is nothing wrong with this idea. There are no permanent enemies or permanent friends between countries. There are only eternal interests. Choosing the latter, Chu state can gain the greatest gain at the minimum cost. When Tang Ning saw Emperor Chu, he was pacing in the palace with a thoughtful look on his face. Apparently he had not made a decision. Seeing Tang Ning come in, he looked at him and asked, "What do you think about this matter?" Tang Ning said, "If Chu does not send troops, Xiaoan will send 100,000 troops to support Wanyan tribe." "Why?" Emperor Chu looked at him and asked. "Xiaoan is far away from Hyman. Even if they conquer the Sushan people, their next target will be our Chu country." Tang Ning shook her head and said, "The western region is also bordered by the grassland. I still understand the meaning of lips dying and teeth falling cold." Emperor Chu looked at him with deep eyes and asked, "Why do I think you have any selfish motives for sending troops so diligently? Hyman is everyone's enemy. Helping the Sushan people is helping us. What selfish motives can I have?" Tang Ning glanced at him and asked, "Does your majesty think it's because I have a crush on their female Khan?"